It's time to think again about death and life, humility and honor, leadership and service, worship and calling. It's time to think again about the role of spiritual friendships, letting go of anxiety and celebrating missions. It is time to think again.
Hey everyone, it's good to see you tonight and it's good to be with you. As we said and we saw in the bumper, we're looking at this new series as we look through Philippians and we're calling it Think Again. And I want to start by telling you a story. James Teagle, last September in the Santander triathlon in Spain, was about to have a top tier finish. He was in third spot in the triathlon. And as he was about 100 yards from the finish line, he got confused and actually left the course and began to run towards the spectators. Behind him was Diego Mantrera, and he was in fourth position, but now because of James's mistake, he was now in third position, and he had the opportunity for a top tier place in one of the most prestigious triathlons in the world. Well, when Diego realised what James had done, and that he would get third place, he actually began to slow down, and he eventually stopped to allow James to realise his mistake, to come back, pass him, and get the third place that he was going to get in the first place. So Diego ended up in fourth position, did not get a top tier finish, and did not get one of the coveted spots. Afterwards on Instagram he said, "You know what? I would do that again." The winner of the triathlon, Javier Noya, said, "This is the best in history." Now, I don't know about Javier's statement. That seems a little bit of hyperbole to say it was the best in history. But this article was actually run by the BBC News, and people liked it, and lots of people read it, and I've always thought, well, why do we do that? Because I think we're attracted to these kinds of stories. We're attracted to the story where someone does something completely selfless, does something for the other, and in themselves they lose out in some way. And I don't know about you, but I actually want to have that kind of person as a friend, this selfless person who does things for those around them. Yet if we're honest, it seems like this is the exception to the rule, isn't it? You know, we applaud it as a culture, but the reality is we are not encouraged to be this kind of person. We love to see it in others, but it is the exception, it's not the rule. It stands out because it's so abnormal to see this kind of thing happen. And so we see it and we're like, oh, that's a great thing. Because the voice in the shadows tells us the opposite. It says, you've got to be number one. You've got to get yourself ahead. You've got to outperform others. You have to achieve, you have to get the accolade. And that is not what we saw in this story. You know, to quote one of the best bands of the 1970s, ABBA, the winner takes it all. And it truly is what we have as the voice in the shadows in our culture today. There's no place for the kind runner who lets someone else pass them that they may get the glory. And the reality is that for most of us, the communities we're in foster this idea of self and self-advancement. Now you might say, well, that's not true of us at Yale. That's not the situation in the communities at Yale. But let me ask you some questions, some hard questions to think about. Do people in your community around you readily share when they get a bad grade? Are they willing to admit when a professor trashed a paper they wrote? Because you see, when we don't do that, that's a sign that we live in a competitive culture. Are people willing to say or admit the things that are shameful in their lives, or the anxieties and fears they have? Because when we're not willing to do that, it shows that we're in a society that differentiates from the strong and the weak. And is it the situation here at Yale where we can really genuinely say we are happy for the person who gets the best scholarship or the best internship? Yes.
So we can't really hear what you're saying. You guys might want to switch to phone or something.
Okay, I'm going to go upstairs. Someone take the interlude. Someone say, I'm going upstairs in a minute. You see, that says something about a competitive culture. If people aren't willing to do that, that says we feel there's a competition. Or What about, are people willing to be honest about things they are fearful of or anxious of, or a shame culture? People are willing to share what they are ashamed of. Again, when we're unwilling to do that, that speaks to a culture where we feel that there are strong and there are weak, and we have to keep our cards close to our chest. And think about this, is true in a real culture where we can genuinely celebrate when someone gets the best scholarship or the best internship, especially if it is the one that we wanted to get. And instead we backbite or gossip or try and pull them down. You see, when these are the markers, it speaks to something about our culture. It talks about the voice in the shadows that tells us how we should live. So I don't want answers to those questions, but can I tell you this idea is as old and ancient as it can be? It's been around forever. But tonight, can we imagine living a different way? Can we imagine living in a culture and in a community where people can be honest, vulnerable, transparent about their lives, where people can say when they got a bad grade, when people can share the things they are fearful of or anxious of, or maybe ashamed of? Can we honestly be in a culture where we can truly rejoice whatever internship or scholarship someone else gets? Well, here's the deal. Tonight, we're going to look in Philippians 2, where Paul asks us to think again about what real community and real relationships look like. He's going to ask us to think about what does it mean to truly be a real biblical Christian community and what that can do for you and it can do for those around you. We're going to think again about real community tonight. So let's read Philippians 2 verses 1 through 11. Philippians 2 verses 1 through 11. Let me read that for you. Philippians 2 verses 1 up through 11. Paul says this: if then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the cross of death, to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so at the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Okay, so here's Paul, he's speaking to this community that he loves. He loves the Philippians. And he starts in chapter 2, verse 1 with this really weird, almost like Shakespearean soliloquy. Like, he's at the front of the stage, he's like, is there any love? Is there any compassion? It's like, dude, what are you saying? What are you doing? But when you begin to understand how Greek letters were constructed in the Greek language, it would read better like this. Let me read what Paul is saying. You encouraged me in Jesus. You showed me your love. You moved in the Spirit for me, and you embraced me with compassion and sympathy. If you can do it for me, do it also for those around you. So why is saying this? Why is Paul saying this to a church he loves? Well, when we read the whole letter, we begin to understand there was grumbling and there was disagreement. So here's the first thing we have to face tonight. When we begin to become a real community with real relationships, there will be grumbling and disagreement. There will be discord. That's a sign that you're actually making a real community. That's the sign of real friendship. Why? Because as we come into this community, we bring in the voice in the shadows that tells us, promote yourself, be number one. No one's going to do it for you. Get ahead, achieve, get those accolades. And as we all bring those voices, as we all bring that in, at some point we begin to bump up against one another. And we get grumbling and disagreement. We get in crowds and out crowds. We get favorites. We get tribes. We get gossip. We get backbiting. This is what begins to happen now. At this point, we have to make a decision when it comes to community. And we can do one of three things. The first thing is we can say, I'm out of here. And so our friendships become disposable, our communities become disposable. When they no longer work for us, we walk away. Well, the second thing we do is we decide, you know what, I'm just going to check out. I'm going to be here, but I'm not really here. And so we're in the community, but we're not in the community. We just choose not to engage. We keep everyone at arm's length. Or what we can decide to do is, you know what, I'll just be like everyone else. I'll backbite, I'll grumble, I'll gossip, I'll pull down, I'll push myself ahead. And these are the paths we can take. And Paul could see in this community that he loved, this could begin to happen. So he wants to address it. He wants to speak to them about this. So I'm sure you can think about communities that you're in at Yale where you can probably see all of those scenarios. I remember when I first started college, wait for it, in 1991, no comments. No, look, I can see everyone smirking and nope. Okay, 1991. It's okay, I'm old, I know. And okay, thank you, Jenna, for the shock. And so I went to college and I was top of my year in high school, and I went in and there was a big group of us. We're all in geosciences, we're all in the same discipline in college. And I still remember 30 years later where I was sitting in the library, third floor, in the corner, and one of the guys in my class came up and said, "What did you get in the assignment?" And I was like, that's a weird question to ask me. So I told him, and he smirked and walked away. And I was like, well, that's weird. And then I was like, wait a minute. He got a higher grade than me. He just wanted to boast. Now, here's what you need to understand. Till that point, I was very confident in my academic ability and I was pretty secure in myself. But when I bumped up against someone else, this thing rose up in me that I will simply call insecurity and pride. And they both came up at the same time. And I was like, oh, really? Is that the game? Now, please remember, I was not a Christian at this point. I had not met Jesus. And so I was like, all right, well, bring it on, my friend. Bring it on. And so it became a war between us. He would constantly ask me every time, what'd you get in that assignment? What'd you get in that exam? And I became envious and jealous of how he interacted with the professors and when he did better than me. And the thing was, I didn't like myself on the inside, but this was who I was becoming. But before that, that wasn't me. You see, when you come into proximity with others, that voice in the shadows will begin to rise because you'll bump up against one another. And Paul can see this beginning to happen with the community that he loved. So Paul begins by saying this, look, if you're going to be a real community, if you're going to have real relationships, you got to know this is going to happen because of the culture and worldview that has washed itself over you for years. It's the first thing you need to be aware of. So of course the question becomes, okay then Paul, what do we do? So Paul responds in verse 2, he says, listen, you've got to be united. You've got to be of the same love, same accord, and same mind. It's like, wow, okay, Paul, what does that mean? how do we do that? How can we be people like that? And I don't know about you, when I hear Paul say that, you need to be the same mind, the same love, the same accord, this is unity. The first thing I think is, are you telling me that we all need to be the same, Paul? Like none of us are different in any way, and that's not what Paul's saying. Paul is not saying, do not be a homogeneous blob of everything together. That's not what he's saying, because God has made each of you uniquely. God has made each of you individually. You are made each in the image of God. But he's saying, but be of the same mind. So what does that look like? Well, let me say it like this. So as a person, I'm fairly introverted. I act very slowly and I'm quite quiet. Whereas Sarah, my wife, she is gregarious, she's outgoing, she's spontaneous, everything really I am not, okay? So our temperaments and personalities are very different. But if you ask our kids about what we value as a family and what is important to us, they will tell you the same thing from me or Sarah. You see, even though we're different people, we have the same voice, same love, and same accord when it comes to how our family will be. Does that make sense? So even though we're different, uniquely as God made us, we can be of same one voice. And this is what Paul is saying. You're not to be all the same person, but what it means to be brothers and sisters in the gospel have agreement on that. Be of the same mind, same accord, and same love, but be uniquely who God has made you to be. So that brings me to my final point. So Paul begins by saying, look, think again about what it means to be a real community. Think again what real relationships will mean to you. Don't be like everyone else where when disagreement and it becomes real is there, don't check out, don't walk away, and don't join in. He says, think again about what it means to be a real community. It means you're going to have to be united. You're going to have to have unity. And unity means you're not all the same, but you're going to have the same thoughts about certain things. So again, it begs the question, well, but Paul, how do we do that, Paul? Well, Paul graciously answers us in verses 3 and 4. This is my final point tonight. He explains in verses 3 and 4 how you can be united. And so this is what he says. He says, the vision is unity, and the practice is what you see in 3 and 4. He says, here's what you need to do. If you're going to be a real community, you need to do the following. You need to die to selfish ambition. You need to die to vain glory or conceit, conceit, and you need to pick up humility. He says that's how you're going to be a real community and have real relationships. So what does that mean? Paul says, look, you have to die to selfish ambition. In other words, you need to be willing to say, I will not push myself ahead of the crowd. I will not make sure I'm number one. I will not be Machiavellian. Now, if you're honest, do you see that around you in the Yale culture? And then he says, look, you're going to have to give up vainglory or conceit. What's that? Well, that's the thing where you say, you know what? No one else is saying I'm good, so I'm going to say I'm good. I'm going to promote myself. I'm going to make sure everyone knows who I am. Do we see that around us in our culture at Yale? And Paul says you're going to have to die to that. But then he says, you're going to have to pick up humility. Now, here's the thing. Selfish ambition and vainglory, those were virtues in the Greek or Roman world. Those were virtues. You were meant to be selfish and you were meant to be vain. And when Paul says, walk in humility, that was an anti-virtue. That was the opposite of who they were meant to be. And Paul says, pick up the weak thing and drop what you think is strong. And so what's humility? It's simply, he says, look, esteem others before yourself, build them up. Now, what Paul doesn't say in this is, don't think of yourself at all. That's not what he's saying. That's martyrdom, and he's not asking for that. He's saying, but think of others before yourself. C.S. Lewis, some of you have probably heard this quote before. He puts it like this. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less. Do we see the distinction there? I'm not always thinking about me, but I'm thinking about you. That doesn't mean I disregard me. So Paul's saying, okay, here's the deal. If you want to be a real community of real relationships, it's going to have the foundation of humility. And you're going to have to die to selfish ambition, and you're going to have to die to the idea of vainglory or conceit, because those will prevent you from being that kind of group. Think about Diego Mantrera. That's what he did in that triathlon. He had the chance to get the glory of third place. He had the ability, I mean, his whole identity is the ambition of doing well in triathlons. Yet he was willing to step back to let someone else get it. That was humility. I know that Javier Noy said it was the best in history, but if I'm honest, I'm like, Javier, would you do the same? Would you do the same? You see, that is this notion of humility. It was an anti-virtue to the Greeks and Romans, but Paul's saying it is something I want you to be and do. Okay, let me close this tonight. We all want to be the person who lets others win the race. We all want to be that person that can have the newspaper report where we let someone else pass us. And in our heart, I think we want to be living in that kind of community, don't we? A community that's marked by selflessness, by thinking of others before ourselves. And here we see Paul in Philippians saying, I want you to think again what real community looks like. I want you to think again about what it will cost you to be that kind of group. Let that which seems abnormal in the world around you be normal in Yale Chi Alpha. That it would be a refuge for you and a beacon for those around you. A refuge that you can come to, and a beacon for those around you. So are you willing to choose to live differently tonight? What's it going to cost you? It's going to cost you the revelation that real relationships are messy. But when we get into real community, we're going to have real relationships because we bring in everything that we've learned. And as Jesus changes us and redeems us, like we're learning tonight, we begin to walk in unity. And unity doesn't mean we're all the same person. The uniqueness of our personalities and our temperaments is just amplified because of Jesus. But in certain things, we have the same mind. And the same mind we should have is what it means to be united. And that means that we will die to selfish ambition. We will die to vainglory and conceit, and we will be people of humility. We will be willing to say, you first. I'm thinking about you. This is what Paul is saying to us tonight. Imagine with me, Yale Chi Alpha, that our community is known on Yale's campus as a place where people can come and be themselves. A place where there can be honesty and vulnerability and transparency that leads to transformation. That we can be a community where people are always thinking of someone else, how you can encourage them, how you can put them in the spotlight, how you can lift them up, how you can come alongside them, how you can be their number one fan. A community that speaks positively of those around them. This is what Paul is asking us to be tonight. This is who Paul is calling us to be. A community where we can say, hey, in the race, I'm going to let you pass me. I don't need the glory. I don't need it. I don't need all of this stuff, but I'm going to let you take the limelight and shine in this moment. Are we willing to be that community? This is the challenge before us all tonight. So let me put 3 challenges before you, Yale Chi Alpha, tonight. 3 things that should mark our community. Here's the first one. I challenge you this week to somehow, and it will probably be virtually, to spend time with someone who's on the fringe of our community, or maybe even outside our community. Would you spend time with them this week? Somehow, virtually. Bring the outsider in. I challenge you this week to do some reverse gossiping, as we've heard about before. In other words, speak positively about 3 people this week when others are wanting to pull them down. Would you lift them up? And then the last one, would you model honesty and vulnerability this week before others, in whatever way that may be, that others may realize there's something different about you, that you can do that? And as you model that honesty and vulnerability, you might be the doorway for others to do the same. And as we do that, I honestly believe that our community can become a community that's a refuge for you, but also a beacon for those around us at Yale. Think again about real relationships. Think again about real community. We're now going to take a moment of reflection and take some time to think about this, but not only think about it, I want to make an invitation tonight. Maybe for you, you're like, I have never been in a community like that. I don't even know what that kind of community means or looks like. I want to encourage you tonight to reach out to one of the campus pastors on this call, chat with them privately if you want to, and ask them how you can step into that kind of life. It's a challenge for all of us, but with Jesus, we know we can. So let's take a moment now, just in quiet, and afterwards, Hannah will come and pray once I've closed this out. So let's take a moment just to reflect on what we've heard tonight.